Hello? Ooh, okay. Welcome, everybody. My name's Jen Pizer. I'm the student chair of the Committee on Lectures, and which is partly funded by GSB, or I think fully funded by GSB, actually. So I'd like to welcome you here tonight. And to start off, I'd like to let everybody know that as an extension of the series on globalization, trade, debt, and civil disorder, in February on the 12th, we'll be having author Laurie Garrett, author of The Coming Plague, come to speak about her book as well. So we can look forward to that. But still concentrating on this fall, tonight we have Barry Commoner here. We're very excited. If you, we're encouraging you to stay for the reception afterward, which is hosted by Biology, and feel free to purchase one of Dr. Commoner's books back there. He'll be available to speak with and sign afterwards. Dr. Commoner was director for the Center of Biology of Natural Systems at Queens College in New York City for 34 years. Most recently, he was the lead researcher for a team from the North American Commission for Environmental Cooperation, which issued a report naming Ames, the Ames power plant, as one of the top 10 dioxin emitters detected in northern Canada. The commission was established under the North American Free Trade Agreement to address regional environmental issues. His publications include Science and Survival, The Closing Circle, Energy and Human Welfare, The Poverty of Power, The Politics of Energy, and Making Peace with the Planet. He received a doctorate in biology from Harvard University. So if you could please join me in welcoming Dr. Barry Commoner.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be back in Ames. This is my third visit, I think. Yeah. And I know it's a special occasion in various ways. And it's a really wonderful... It's not on?
It's on. It needs. There we go.
All right. It's a special occasion because it just so happens that the fuss that our study caused here in Ames just fit in with Pat Miller's program this year, globalization. And so it made the subject matter for this talk really very easy and, well, not too easy, but quite direct. And really what I want to talk about is the way in which the expression of our environmental problems on a global scale relates back to local issues like the Ames power plant. And I think this is something which we're going to have to be confronting on a national scale. You know, we're all aware of the fact that there are now effects on the planet, on the entire skin of the planet, the soil, the vegetation, the air, affecting the temperature. So global warming is clearly a planetary environmental crisis. And I think by now everybody knows it, including the people who are worried about the expense and have been trying to say it's not really happening. You know, the first sign of global warming is simply violent weather, for a very obvious reason. The weather is driven by energy from the sun. If we are collecting more energy, as evidenced by the increased temperature, then we are going to get more extremes of weather. And there's a very simple way of measuring that. And even some of the skeptics are aware of it. And that is, you go to the insurance industry. The insurance industry has to pay for the damage of violent storms, floods, and so on. In the last decade, their expenses for violent weather events has gone up sixfold. It's a threat, actually, to their fiscal viability. And it keeps going up. Floods in England in the last week or so hadn't appeared in that severity over a century. So I think it's taken now. We are in global warming caused by things that we have done and continue to do. There's a treaty that we signed in Kyoto, but it's absolutely clear that practically nothing is going to be done. The latest brilliant proposal from Mr. Clinton was to figure out ways of shifting the cost to other people, credits for allowing another country to emit because we're going to do less. And what's being called as a solution is conservation of energy. Well, sure, that's a good thing. It's a good idea to use less energy for what you're going to get out of it. But there's a limit to that. Energy is absolutely essential. And the problem is that we haven't faced the problem of going to ways of producing energy that do not result in warming the earth. So there's a global problem that we are, shall we say, calmly dealing with very inadequately. The same is true of the ozone problem. The ozone in the stratosphere protects us from ultraviolet light. Every year, the degree of ultraviolet light coming down, particularly in the southern hemisphere, becomes more intense. Yet we have a treaty about cutting back on the emissions of the chemicals that cause this, but it hasn't worked. In other words, there is a global environmental crisis, and it's a crisis in the sense that we know what's happening. We're trying to do something about it, but very little has succeeded. And it's true locally as well. I mean, are you aware of the fact that a basic air pollutant, nitrates, nitrogen oxides that cause smog, the emissions nationally in the United States have been constant since 1970, and the latest EPA projection to 2010 is that it'll rise somewhat. And most of the other standard pollutants like carbon monoxide particles have gone down only slightly. In other words, we're really not solving our environmental problems, and many of them are getting worse. Well, one question is, why are we so paralyzed? Why are we putting these things off? It's as though, well, that's a planetary problem. It's not ours. It's not in our backyard. One thing that my reaction to what happened with our report in Ames was, well, this is a wake-up call. And in that sense, it ought to be constructive. And as a matter of fact, I want to report, I've talked with Bob Kindred, the assistant city manager, on the phone. I just met him for the first time here, and he informs me that the city council has decided to investigate the proper action in response to our report about Ames, the Ames plant emitting, we think, dioxin. And the proper response to that is test it. It hasn't been tested since 1981, and then, because the methods were primitive then, very inadequately. And now the council is going to look into the question of working out a way of doing a test. So there are ways of responding, and it's interesting that this response came to a report that what Ames was doing was affecting a small group of indigenous people, 25,000 of them, up in the Arctic, the Inuit, very remarkable people, who are concerned about this sort of thing because of the fact that they have essentially no sources of contamination of that sort. And it's interesting that rather than the fact that this has been going on for quite a while, and as I'll show you very soon, has had effects on the milk that you drink. We had to go to the Arctic, so to speak, to wake up. And that's, I think, a very important aspect of this problem that I want to look at. And so it's something that we really need to go through and talk over in connection with the linkage between Ames and Nunavut. Nunavut is the new province that the Inuit wrested out of the Canadian government by a brilliant set of analyses. Absolutely brilliant. See, what they had to do, there are 25,000 people, the Inuit, living in a territory twice the size of Texas. It's a very low population density. And they believed that they had the right to set up a provincial government over that huge territory because they lived in it. Well, how many acres can one person live in? The way they did it was absolutely brilliant. And they now known, there's a lot of restlessness among indigenous people now. And the Inuit are now looked on as the people who learned how to do it. It took them 10 years. Working with anthropologists and nutritionists and environmentalists in Canada, almost all Canadians, they produced an atlas. If I could carry it, I would bring it. It's a book this big. We have one. It's a marvelous book. And it opens up, and on one side you have geographic, very detailed geographic scaled maps. And on one side is an inventory of the animals that they hunt. An actual inventory with numbers, little figures of the animals and so on. On the other side is the same area mapped out with shading and dotted lines showing where and when the Inuit hunt for those animals in that territory, establishing that their livelihood occupied that huge area. When I saw that, it reminded me of a wonderful, well, not so wonderful, one of the really idiotic things that the United States government aided and abetted by Teller, Dr. Teller out in California. There was a time when we were doing peaceful development of atomic bombs. And there was Teller got the idea of building a harbor with a nuclear bomb. Dig out a harbor. Where can you do that without causing a lot of trouble? Well, what you need is a shoreline that's uninhabited. And he found one up in Alaska by looking around, and he saw, well, there's a town up here and one down here and hundreds of miles in between. Said, okay, we'll do the bomb. Well, the Eskimos and Indians who lived there got wind of it with a little help from some of us in St. Louis at the time, and learned about it, learned that it would poison the caribou and them, and they blocked the whole thing. But to go back to the Inuit, they're really, excuse me, they're really marvelous people. What they got with this atlas and 10 years of negotiation, they got the right 2 years ago to set up this province. They have their own parliament now. They have the mineral rights and all the hunting rights, and they got several $1 billion over the next 10 years of money from the Canadian government to help them get going. Well, I say that because that explains why we did the study. We did the study because the Inuit were very concerned about it, so much so that they played a very important role in the treaty that the UN has been trying to set up, so-called POPs Treaty, the Persistent Organic Pollutants, of which dioxin is a very important one. It's in trouble, like all of these international environmental treaties. But in, I think, the second conference, they heard from the Inuit about their problems. And it had a very important effect in pushing this treaty forward. So we were very much interested in seeing whether these POPs, and dioxin is one, polychlorbiphenyls is another. These are persistent, very stable, they're organic, and they have a tendency to volatilize under certain temperatures and then in cold weather come down. And the end result is that there's a tendency for them to move northward. In the summer, for example, dioxin and PCBs will volatilize, and as they migrate, they get to northern regions. There, at the lower temperature, they tend to cling on to particles and come down to the ground. The next summer, they volatilize and take another trip northward. And the result is they get to the Arctic Circle and there's no place to go that's colder. And so the Inuit have been exposed to more dioxin than you would expect from the fact that they don't have sources of dioxin. And so what we were interested in was linking up the amount coming down in the Arctic to the sources that produced it. Now, why? Well, the Inuit were interested in doing something about it. And they thought, and it's a very sound idea, that what you do is you go back to where it comes from and see if they can't stop doing what they're doing. That's really what they were interested in. And so we felt that we should try to understand how material that is put into the air in the United States and Canada and even in Mexico can get up there. Now, how do we know that it gets up there? Well, the Canadians have been making measurements. They find it in caribou, in seal, in polar bear, and they find it in the mother's milk of the Inuit at a level which is twice the level found among mothers in southern Canada, which is roughly the level that we get in the United States. And we'll talk about what that means in terms of health. But the fact is that for a number of years it's been known that this area, which has almost no sources of dioxin or PCBs, has been afflicted by both of these things. And really the major way in which it can get there from the sources we know we have them here is really through the air. And so what we did was to try to work out a way of finding a way of identifying and ranking the sources that generate dioxin with respect to their influence on Nunavut. Now, it was known that the way in which it gets into caribou, say, is that it has to fall on the food that the caribou eat, lichen. And so what we decided to do was to work out, using this wonderful atlas, we set up areas, roughly 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers, an area where we knew they were hunting caribou, an area near it where we knew along the shore they hunted seal, which is another major source of food. And we said, okay, they are our receptors. And we're going to try to find out how much dioxin comes down to each of these receptors. And we set up 8 sites across this huge territory. That is, we chose them. We didn't do anything. It was all done in Queens. Then we've been working in this area. We had an inventory of the known dioxin sources in the United States and Canada. What we started with was a U.S. EPA inventory, and Environment Canada, its EPA, has one too. And we have had working relations with them. So we have in our computer system this inventory. And Mexico did not have an inventory, and so we undertook to make at least an initial one down there with some help from the government. And we ended up with a list of 44,019 sources in Canada, the United States, and Mexico that were known by either the United States EPA, Environment Canada, or work that we ourselves had done to be emitters of dioxin into the air. So the issue was, what's the connection between those 44,000 sources and the dioxin coming down at these ecologically important receptors? Why are they ecologically important? Because they're entry points into the human food chain. The Inuit eat caribou, they eat seal, and so on. We'll get back to that too. So that was our problem. And actually, we have been working on that problem since 1993. And we had already been in touch with NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency, which has a computer model that has in it very detailed weather now for the entire globe. And that's recent. Luckily, when we started the Nunavut thing, we turned around and realized that the models we had didn't go down to Mexico, but they came up, the 4th model now is global. And so they know on a grid about 80 kilometers all over the world what the weather is from reports and interpolations at 6 levels up to a rather high altitude with hourly data, actually. And that has been, you might say, well, why did they develop it? The answer is very simple. It was developed in order to deal with warning people about nuclear accidents. You know, like Chernobyl. In fact, it was used on Chernobyl. If there's a nuclear accident, you very quickly want to tell people downwind who's going to be affected. In other words, you want to be able to say a puff of radioactivity coming out from a damaged nuclear power plant right here is going to go mostly there and not here, and how fast it'll get there. And these are not straight lines. If you plot what the model does, you can see winds blowing this way at one time, another way another time, and the traveling is quite zigzag. At any rate, we learned about that, and working very closely with them, Mark Cohn, who was on our staff at the time, did such a terrific job applying this model to dioxin that he's now been hired by NOAA. But that's all right. He trained some people that he left behind. At any rate, what that meant was that we could put into the model algebra algorithms, that told us what a molecule of dioxin was doing once it left the source from time to time, how it diffused, how it interacted with dust particles, because when it's attached to a dust particle, it'll behave differently, how it interacted with other pollutants, which may destroy the dioxin, how much comes down near the source, a little further from the source. And you need to know that, because if you're looking at something far away, you need to know how much was lost on the way. And so the model does all of that. In other words, what it does, very simply, is this. If we know how much dioxin is put into the air over a year, let's say, at a particular latitude and longitude, the model will estimate how much will come down anywhere else. You can have it in Timbuktu, wherever. And we can do that with, we use ordinary PC computers, but a bank of 6 of them. You can do that with 44,000 sources. And so what we were doing was tracing puffs, if you like, of dioxin from 44,000 sources to each of 8 sites where there were 2 receptors, one marine and one terrestrial. And doing that hour by hour for an entire year, 1996, mid-1996 to 97. And the end result was that we could rank those sources with respect to how much they were responsible for what was coming down at the different receptors. And a lot of interesting data. For example, the northernmost site, see, most of the sources turn out to be in the eastern U.S. So the northernmost site gets 1/10 of what the southernmost site was, and they're about 1,500 kilometers apart. So the ones closer to eastern United States get more. And we worked that out. But what most important was we could rank the sources with respect to how much they were responsible. And so, for example, and it varied from one receptor to another. One receptor, Coral Harbor, which is right on an island in the middle of Hudson Bay, we simply took as a standard how many sources were responsible for putting down 1/3 of the total deposition. At Coral Harbor, it was 19 out of 44,000 sources. At Iqaluit, which was way out west, it was 39. So between 19 and 39 sources were responsible for 1/3. If you want to know how much is responsible for a half, the number goes up to a couple of hundred. But what this told us right away was you could learn a lot and do a lot by ranking the sources in that way. And the Inuit were very happy to know that, because they were interested in knowing who can they talk to about this. So that's really what we were doing. And as it turned out, we looked at the top 10 sources, and lo, Ames was there. Now, as I say, the problem with Ames was that it has never had a modern analysis with respect to dioxin. It was done once in 1981 at a time when the analytical methods weren't really developed. The analyses are so difficult that in 1981, I think the only other laboratory besides the Ames laboratory was Midwest Research Institute, and that is now very experienced. and is now authorized by EPA. I think there are no more than 2 or 3 authorized laboratories. At any rate, we can talk about that. I'm sure some of you will have questions. But I want to go on to get to the reason for being concerned about this. What's the health problem? What's it about? Well, this has been looked at very thoroughly. Dioxin is now probably the most intensely analyzed, researched pollutant that we know of, largely because of public concern over the dioxin in Agent Orange, the dioxin that affected the people in Vietnam when the Agent Orange was used there, affected the veterans, and a lot is known. And EPA, since 1985, has been steadily trying to analyze what the literature says and has put out repeated assessments, reassessments of the dioxin problem. And the reason why it's been done is that every time they put out an assessment, there was controversy. That is, the petrochemical industry that was producing for example, Agent Orange, that was contaminated with dioxin. Obviously, they were concerned, and a lot of controversy was generated simply by people objecting to the kind of results that were coming out. And one of the curious things is that there have now been basically 4 reassessments. And each new reassessment was a result of pressure from people who felt that EPA was exaggerating the health effects. That's why they were assessed once again. And each time, the next assessment came up convincingly, showing that the problem was worse than they thought. And to go to the last 2 reassessments, let me give you the picture. The latest reassessment was made public in draft form in June of this year, and the previous one was in 1994. Now, in 1994, I'll give you the end result, so to speak. See, it was known from animal studies that dioxin is a powerful carcinogenic agent. Very powerful. I'll give you some sense of it soon. And the question was, how does it affect people? You can't do experiments with people, and you have to worry about looking for epidemiological data. There have been accidents. The veterans were exposed to dioxin, and you can do some assessments there. At any rate, what in 1994 was learned was, first, that dioxin at that point was regarded as a certain animal carcinogen and a probable human carcinogen. Dioxin, incidentally, is a group of, a couple of hundred related compounds, 17 of which are toxic at various degrees. And the toxicity is measured against one group, which is the most toxic. So there's a way of assessing how this group of 17 important dioxins, and dioxin is a misnomer really. They really include dioxins proper and furans, which are very closely related, and certain PCBs act the same way. At any rate, in 1994, it was concluded from measurements of dioxin in people's bodies, samples of body fat were analyzed, and by analyzing the diet, what people ate, for dioxin, it was concluded that on the average, the U.S. population took into their bodies in food about 120 billions of a gram of dioxin per day. Now, I can tell you, 120 billionths of a gram is invisible. We once worked with something like that in the lab, and it's not there. I mean, you don't know what you know what you're seeing. At any rate, it's a very small amount, and the taking into account the probable carcinogenicity to people and what was known about animals, it was concluded that the one biological hazard that was understood, carcinogenicity, represented that amount of intake in the diet represented a risk over a person's lifetime of acquiring cancer, any kind of cancer, over a lifetime, a risk of between between 500 in a million, and I'll explain why we're doing it that way, 500 in a million and 1,000 in a million. Now, the reason why it's done that way is that EPA has been using a so-called, quote, acceptable risk of cancer in evaluating toxic effects of 1 in a million. So, for example, when an environmental impact statement is done on an incinerator, let's say, that's emitting dioxin, the big argument is the effect 1 in a million or more or less? So, in 1994, we were talking about the general U.S. population running a risk of 500 to 1,000 times higher than the acceptable risk. And where did it come from? Came from animal fat. 2/3 of the exposure was due to milk fat, dairy products, fat, and beef, the fat in beef. The rest from other smaller animals and fish. In other words, 95% of the exposure is by what you eat, diet. Why? Dioxin is very soluble in fat. It accumulates in fat so that larger animals get more dioxin because they're older. In other words, chickens have less time to get contaminated than cows. We know, in 1994, that's what we knew. And the EPA set up as a hypothesis in their report that the way this happened was that it was emitted into the air, spread around through the air, came down on farms, got into the pasture, corn, eaten by animals, gets into milk, cheese, beef, and into our diet. That was a hypothesis. And I was going to say, I was happy to see it. In a way I was, but it's a silly thing to be happy about, because in 1993, we decided to investigate this by using the model. And the first thing we did was to try it out by following dioxin from the sources into the Great Lakes. But then, a few years ago, we actually traced dioxin from all the sources in the United States and Canada to 4 farms, dairy farms, in Wisconsin, and 4 dairy farms in Vermont. In that study, we actually measured the amount of dioxin in the air at the farms. We measured how much was in the pasture, how much was in the mixed feed that was used by some farms, how much was in the milk, and tracked it all the way. And we used our model to compare what the model said was in the air with what was in the air, and got pretty good agreement. And more important, we could then make a list of the incinerators and other places that were feeding the dioxin into the milk in Wisconsin. Two sites in Wisconsin where we actually measured it. And I have to tell you, one of those sites in southeast Wisconsin, we looked at which sources were responsible, in this case, for 60% of the dioxin that was coming down on the farm. And the Ames incinerator is one of them. Why should you be surprised? Don't you suppose the dioxin fell to the ground between Ames and Nunavut? And a lot of it, more, comes down in Wisconsin than comes down in Nunavut, because it's closer. It gets thinned out as it goes out. Now, what's the name of the dairy company? Anderson Erickson. That's where you buy your milk. And I try to find out where the dairies that produce it are, and I imagine that some of it comes from Wisconsin. Anyway, you think you're badly off. Let me tell you about New York. New York City is dioxin free. It's a dioxin free zone. We, for the last 20 years, have been fighting incinerators, and there are no more. There isn't a municipal waste incinerator. There isn't a hospital waste incinerator in New York City. And our brilliant mayor decided the way to take care of trash was to ship it out. And so we're shipping a lot of it to Newark, New Jersey, where an incinerator is burning it. And I guarantee you it's contaminating the milk on the dairy farms in New Jersey. And half of our milk sold in New York City comes from farms in New Jersey. Now, as Jimmy Durante used to say, these are the conditions that prevail. And this is now the fact that we have to live with. That agriculture, farmers, have been recruited as passive agents of transmitting dioxin from the sources into our bodies. That is exactly what has happened. It is not their fault. They're just doing what they do. You know, in Vermont, we looked at farms that were doing the old-fashioned thing. The cows were out in the open, eating grass. And that's all they ate. These were very carefully managed pasture farms, doing things the good old way. And they had as much dioxin in them as the ones that were eating silage and so on. Oh, I should tell you something very important to know about. It was a lucky thing. There is practically no dioxin in the grain of corn. That's a very, very important thing. You see, you understand, this has been going on now since the 1930s. And so this stuff has been going in the air and settling down all over the United States and Canada and the Arctic. And it's very stable. So a lot of it is in the soil. And in fact, anything that's been out in the open has been contaminated, not only by dioxin, but a whole series of stable organochlorine compounds. The result is when you burn wood, you produce dioxin. Because whenever you burn organic matter that has chlorine in it, you will get dioxin because it's so very stable. Now, the soil is contaminated. Fortunately, most plants do not take dioxin up from the soil through their roots. The way it gets into the plant is through the stomata, the holes that take in carbon dioxide. And it stays in the leaves. So in the corn silage, if it's just vegetation, it'll be low in dioxin. It'll be high in dioxin. The grain will be low. And the fortunate thing about it is that if we ever get around to cutting off the sources, the milk will clean up pretty fast. In fact, the only thing that'll keep it from cleaning up instantaneously will be that the cows, having been raised on dioxin-contaminated food, still have it in their fat and are secreting it. But once the cows have lived their time and you have dioxin-free cows,